Next up, it's an honor for me to introduce two amazing panelists. Tahira Rehmatullah is a partner at Highland Ventures and CEO and founder of Commons. She is a badass investor in the cannabis space. Representative Nancy Mace from South Carolina needs no introduction, but to me, it's crazy. It's something unthought of only a few years ago for a Republican from South Carolina who went to military school to be one of the major supporters of cannabis legalization, to manage to get someone like Amazon or Charles Cook's foundations to get behind cannabis legalization. So let's hear it up for Tahira and Nancy.
Put you in the... Come a little closer. Hello. Ooh, bright lights. Hi.
Good afternoon.
How are you?
Good.
Well, thanks so much for joining us, everybody, and you as well, Nancy.
Good afternoon, y'all. Thank you for being here this afternoon.
Yeah, give yourselves a round of applause. You made it. Nancy, obviously, there are 1,000 things we can talk about. We'll get into as many as we can in 20 minutes. But first, I really want to hear about you. Like, what's your story? Why cannabis?
Right. I know some people are thinking, why is a young woman, or not that young woman, from South Carolina talking cannabis?
Yep.
This is an issue that is very near and dear to my heart. It's personal. I am a freshman member of Congress. I am a Republican. I would say I'm conservative before I'm Republican. And yes, I support cannabis. I was a state lawmaker in South Carolina for 3 years before coming to Congress, and I supported and led part of the movement for medical cannabis reform in the state of South Carolina, which, by the way, is about to get a vote on the floor of the State House of South Carolina. And I met someone from Greenville a few moments ago, and I know we've got some folks from South Carolina in the room today, so thank you for being here. But when I was 16, I was raped by a classmate of mine from high school, and I dropped out of school shortly thereafter. I took a job as a waitress at a Waffle House on the side of the interstate because my parents said if I was going to stop going to school, I got to start going to work. Well, during this very traumatic time in my life, I was prescribed antidepressants. The antidepressants that I took actually made my depression worse, or made me feel like my depression was worse. So then I started self-medicating with cannabis for a period of time in my life. And I really credit that experience with saving my life. I don't know where I would be today. I always sort of joke I'd be dead or in jail, but I guess there's still time. There's still time. But the issue for me is personal because cannabis as an issue, it's not an on-ramp. It is often the case. It is an off-ramp from something else.
Yep.
And I would come out of that experience after dropping out of high school, and I would go on to be the first woman to graduate from the Citadel, the Military College of South Carolina, in 1999. Yeah. So it really saved my life.
That's a pretty big deal.
So.
It's incredible, and I think for a lot of us here, for both cannabis, psychedelics, it's personal, and I think that's a driving factor to it. You wouldn't necessarily link that with a Republican from South Carolina. How, this is kind of digging back in further. How did you know to take cannabis? Were you already a consumer? Like, I don't think I knew at that time that it could potentially help me with. Name the ailment, right? But depression and anxiety and what you were dealing with at that time.
Well, for starters, it was easily available. I mean, you could get it. This is back in the 90s. It's even more available today. I have 2 kids, both teenagers, and they have friends that get access to it all the time, before school, after school, during school, wherever. But it was easy to access. But I knew when I took it, I just knew at the time it cut my anxiety. And I was able to sleep at night. Because when you're assaulted in that way, not only is it physically traumatic, but the mental and emotional trauma that happens for me has been a lifetime. It's not something you overcome overnight. But I knew inherently that if I took this thing, that it would cut my anxiety. I would be less stressed. I could function. I could go to work. I couldn't go to school because I dropped out of school. but I could go to a job, I could get a paycheck, and I would eventually get my high school diploma by taking college courses, because there was no way in hell I was going back to high school after that. But it changed my life. And since that time, my dad's a veteran. He spent 28 years serving in the U.S. Army. He had 2 tours of combat in Vietnam and one in the 1965 coup d'etat of the Dominican Republic. But when I talked to vets, I went to many of his Vietnam reunions, and these guys were so hurt by what they had seen, by what they had witnessed, the trauma, the PTSD, the suicides, the illnesses from being exposed to Agent Orange, and understanding that cannabis can be a life-saving measure for so many people. And when I meet veterans and I talk to them, I feel that pain because I've had that pain, and I can really connect with them personally on that level. The same time, I met a young woman, 14 years old, Mary Louise Swing is her name. She's from Charleston, South Carolina, but her mother has been the lead champion. Her name is Jill Swing for the Compassionate Care Act in South Carolina. Well, Mary Louise was born with cerebral palsy and epilepsy. And until she could get a product like CBD, but even better with THC, she was having 2,000 seizures an hour. And you got her medical cannabis. Well, this kid, it literally has changed. It's saved her life. It's changed her life. Yeah. Doesn't have seizures every hour like she's used to have. But it seems like it should be a crime to limit that from people. And my parents, I'm 44, and my parents are 80 and 82. They're not getting any younger. And my father's like, I don't want you to legalize weed, ever. But I'm like, Daddy, you take CBD oil for your back pain. I mean, like, come on, right? So, but my mom, who's 80, told me when I filed my bill, the States Reform Act in November, she's like, if I ever get sick, send me the best stuff. Well, 2 weeks ago, we got bad news. Mom is sick. And now I'm pissed off that I'm not in a state like South Carolina where I can bring in the best quality product so that she can have the best quality of life as this thing, as we go through what we're going through right now with her diagnoses. And so it's really frustrating, but it's personal on so many levels. But it's not just me or my family. It's millions of people around the country and around the world who've either been wrongly sentenced to prison and, state correctional facilities and jails for a nonviolent crime. It's been a very, very expensive, very harmful war on a plant that should no longer be. But then you have the healthcare side of it, the mental health. We've seen COVID-19 over the last 2 years has destroyed families in some cases. You look at states that have opioid addiction. You have one dispensary in one state, and the rate of opioid addiction and morbidity goes down by over 17%. We've known this for years because it's been all over the Journal of American Medicine. Like, why haven't we done anything yet? And it's really frustrating to see how little progress we've made. The industry is what, $27 billion now, or at least in the next 2 or 3 years, cash only. It's just, what are we doing? And why aren't we doing a better job representing at the federal level? And so it's my job, as it is among every member of Congress, to do the right thing for the right people for the right reasons. And this is one of those places to do just that.
Well, we appreciate, yes, let's hear it for that. Thank you. I think you're preaching to the right audience here. We're very excited about that. So we'll shift a little bit now to politics. So for the second time now, the MORE Act has passed, and that's obviously a Democratic-led comprehensive reform package. It's said that it has no path to pass in the Senate, and I'd love to hear from you a bit about why you view that bill as the wrong form and why you voted against it.
Right. So the MORE Act just passed out of the House for the second time. If it were able to pass both chambers, you wouldn't have to do it multiple times the way we've had. So it's going to go to the Senate now, and it's going to be a stalemate. Senator Schumer has been talking about CAO for a long time. He said he was going to do CAO. He said he was going to do it in August. And I think a lot of us in the room today are questioning, well, which August? Was it August of last year, August of this year, August of next year? That bill has not been done. I think some people have been questioning, well, when is that going to happen? And so we worked on our bill for about 9 months, the States Reform Act. And I wanted to look at what was the CAO going to do? What was MORE going to do? What had David Joyce and others done in the past? And I wanted to have a bill that really could be a framework or a proof of concept, because I don't care who does it, just get the damn thing done, but show what could pass bicamerally in both houses and could be bipartisan because there are a couple things you got to have. And when the MORE Act came up, I guess 2 weeks ago, we went to the offices of Jerry Nadler and we said, hey, we want to bring parity between MORE Act and the States Reform Act, which is my bill. And if you want to tweet about it, it's hashtag States Reform Act today. But, you know, I wanted to bring more parity between MORE and my particular bill. Yep. Because the only way you're going to get cannabis reform done at the federal level is if you do it in a bipartisan way, meaning Republicans and Democrats together have to work together. And if you have a bill that can pass out of both chambers of the House and the Senate together, and MORE was not it. So I said, well, let's try to do that. We had 12 amendments on the MORE Act when it got to Rules Committee. Only Democrat amendments were allowed. No Republican amendments were allowed. Even though we worked on it, we negotiated it. We wanted to build consensus because to get anything done in DC, you have to get both sides working together. And my bill is, there are three really big differences actually. One, the taxes. You've got to keep taxes at the federal excise tax very, very low. I come in at 3%. So
we love taxes.
Yeah, and the way that the states are implementing it, you can't really go above 4.75%. That's what our research says at the federal excise tax level. You've got to have certain guardrails in there because there are some people who are afraid that, hey, when you say legalize, that you're not talking about free markets and competition in businesses. They think legalize, you're going to sell to kids. So you got to have a bill that has guardrails that incentivize states who are selling not to advertise to kids, not to market to kids, not to sell to kids. And I forget which section, it might be 331, but it's about roughly 8% of infrastructure funding could be pulled back at the federal level if your state markets and sells to kids. That's number one. That's how you get Republicans, I think, and moderate Democrats on board. And then number two, having protections for veterans. If you're a veteran in any state in the country under my bill, you can be prescribed medical cannabis for any reason at any time, anywhere, and you're not going to be discriminated at work if you use it. And so that's in there. And then lastly, thank you. And then the fourth is having the regulatory framework. MORE doesn't have the regulatory framework. The taxes are too high. There are not guardrails in there. There are not protections for vets. But the States Reform Act treats cannabis like alcohol. So if you're a retailer, you go through TTB. If you're a grower, you go through the Department of Ag. If you're doing medical, you go through the FDA. It spreads it out. It's turnkey. There's already the framework there. You don't have to wait. You can just press go and be done with it. But the MORE Act didn't have that regulatory framework at the federal level, and it wasn't bipartisan. And so I have a red line on taxes, but in my bill, really everything else is negotiable. If we keep taxes low, then everything else we can work on together. And that's been my message from day one and will continue to be the message. But the States Reform Act is the only bill, it's the last man standing. There's no other cannabis bill in the Congress today that has any chance in hell of moving forward.
Okay. So let's talk a little bit more about the tax element. In your view, the way that it's structured in the MORE Act and the way that's probably been proposed in a lot of different ways, what do you think is a detriment, besides the fact that it's a ridiculous amount of tax, but especially when it relates to like the illegal market?
Yeah, the higher the taxes are, the higher the illegal market will be, or the illicit market in different states. You've got states like Oregon, where the state tax is like 19%. I read an article about Illinois 2 weeks ago that even though they sell less cannabis than they sell alcohol, they're bringing in far more tax revenue from cannabis than alcohol. And so you have to be responsible about implementation at the federal level. You have to keep the federal excise tax very, very low. 25% in a bill called CAO is not, I can't even compute that right now, because as a business, you ought to be profitable. You ought to be able to make a buck or two. You ought to be able to write off expenses on your taxes. You ought to be able to trade on the U.S. stock exchange, not just Canada. But, to do it constitutionally, there are all these things that have to happen, but you got to keep the taxes very, very low to reduce the proclivity of the illicit markets that are out there. And we all know, like, the more illegal markets you have, the more fentanyl that's going to be laced in this stuff that none of us want to get off the streets. And we don't want anybody else getting it either. Yeah. So you got to keep taxes very, very low.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's talk a little bit about like the social equity component, because that's actually a big piece of MORE and has been, part of the New York policy that has passed recently. Your view has been that it should be at the state level versus at the federal. Can we talk a little bit about like what's your view on that?
Yeah, so the social equity piece is, I don't have obviously nearly as much as the MORE Act, which is very much driven by social equity. You can't get Republicans on board with that part of it. But what you can do is you can have things like in the States Reform Act, we have safe expungement and release. So if it's a nonviolent cannabis crime, you're not a Mexican cartel gang drug member, it's not a DUI, it releases about 2,600 inmates, and oh, by the way, saved $600 million over 5 years. I don't know a single Republican or Democrat who would not like that. There is an element that I have in my bill that if you're a disadvantaged business, however the SBA wants to define that you can have your fees for the permitting side of it waived, which is about $10,000. So for a startup or a business that is disadvantaged, there's that. But the rest of it really needs to be driven by the states. And there's this thing that I often tell Republicans who are against any kind of cannabis reform, there's this thing called federalism. And the idea of federalism is rooted in the rights of states to have more power and more control, because the government closest to the people is the government that governs best. And oh, by the way, it's actually a conservative, used to be, I don't know anymore, depending on who you talk to, but it used to be a very Republican ideal. It used to be part of our platform. But if you talk about it in that term and you give it to the states to handle, you're going to get a lot more Republican support. And again, you have to have a bill at the federal level that is bipartisan. And that's one of the ways you get Republicans on board and Democrats, leaving it up to the states.
Do you think that there will be an effective way that states then implement social equity measures if put at the state level and not done something on a national level?
Yes, and I think that we're learning, as some of you probably know better than I do, that every state is different on the social equity piece of it. Some states are doing very well. Some states are not doing well at all. And I just read or heard today that with the permit applications in New York, that they're getting 0 to 9, like 0 to none applications with minority businesses in that case of it. So like states are learning, and I think you have to experiment a little and learn what works best in order to implement it best. And I think states will see what other states have done and learn from that. If you have a one size fits all at the federal government, it's not going to work for every single state because every state is different. One of the things I do talk about a lot as a Republican are the disparities in arrests. So even in South Carolina, you're 4 times as likely as a Black or brown or African American to get arrested for a nonviolent cannabis crime than white. And which is why I really push safe expungement and release, and what that means, how much money the federal government can save, and how many lives we can restart and have a better quality of life.
Now, when you've said that you think that cannabis is actually like a uniting topic, that it's like apple pie. How has your conversations been with, people in your own party who, there's a whole range of support or lack of support, and what's the sentiment now? What are the topics that they are maybe still opposed to that you're trying to convince them of?
Right. So I would say it's twofold. On the left side of the aisle, it's mostly social equity, and it's selling the argument of why we give states the power and why that's the way to go about doing it. On the right side of the aisle, I get pushback. The most of the pushback that I get is on expungement and release. But the minute that I explain that it's safe, that we're not including Mexican drug gang cartels, that we're not including DUIs, and oh, by the way, it saves the government hundreds of millions of dollars, they're like, send me the bill, all right? But the other thing that's at play here is that this is an election year. And I learned at the Citadel, I learned 2 things. One, to have courage, to speak up for yourself, to speak up for others, to give a voice to the voiceless. In other words, lean in no matter what. I also learned to have confidence. But not every member of Congress has that kind of courage or confidence. And so when I do get pushback from Republicans on expungement or release, or hey, I hear that, okay, I have a Republican primary in 4 weeks, I can't get on the bill yet, I'll get on the bill after my primary. One of the other things that we're doing is I'm saying, go poll the issue. I'll poll the issue in your district for you. Look at the data. And we have a lot of great groups. Greg Heyman out of New York, his staff has been really good about sending us information So if you guys have any information about your state or any studies, I'm going to give you my URL at the end of this thing. Send it to us, because I'll then go and I'll say, no, it doesn't increase violent crime. No, kids are not getting access to it. They already have access today. I know this firsthand because of my own kids and what they see every day. And oh, by the way, the opioid epidemic, what does this do for their state and their community? Giving them that information. And I recently acquired a Republican primary opponent. My primary is on June 14th, endorsed by the former president. But I went and I polled my bill a couple weeks ago with the most conservative, reddest, ruby red voters in my district in South Carolina, in conservative South Carolina. And what I learned is that almost 2/3 of Republican primary voters support the States Reform Act because it's states driven, it's federalism, it's states' rights. That is a conservative ideal. So when you blend that and you tell people that this is what it does and this is what it doesn't do, you can get the vast majority. You can go from socialist to QAnon and get the whole spectrum on board with you on this issue. So in my case, in my district, my particular district, it's a swing district, it's purple, but it's almost 2/3 support the rights of states to do whatever they want on cannabis. It's even higher for medical, it's 70-30. But interestingly, in my state, the vast majority of constituents want full adult recreational use as well. So I'm a unicorn in South Carolina. I would imagine the rest of the state's probably 45-55 or 55-45, but it's more like the rest of the country.
Okay. So now just thinking forward, what are kind of major milestones or what can we expect for State Reform Act, and what should we be hearing about?
So now that the MORE Act has passed, Democrats are now going to get on board to co-sponsor the States Reform Act. Don Young, God bless his soul, may he rest in peace. Love that guy. He was the first Republican to sign up to co-sponsor the States Reform Act. But you will see Democrats one for one. So as I add Republicans, we'll add one Democrat because I want it to be dead even. I don't want to have a bill that's 50 Republicans or 50 Democrats and five of the other side. It's got to be equally done. We're going to be having a hearing on the Oversight Committee. So I am the ranking Republican on the Civil Rights Committee, which is chaired by Jamie Raskin. Jamie and I have talked about doing a hearing. He's promised me that hearing this year. So when we get back, we're back in session next week. We're going to be working on dates and times for that, and we will announce it because we want people to see that. And then as Republican primaries go through, you'll see us starting to add more Republicans one by one by one. So I'd like to have at least 10 or 20 co-sponsors from both parties at the end of the day when we finally get this thing done.
Excellent. Awesome. Yes, thank you. So last note, we're at time. What can we do? You have a room full of people who care about this industry. What should we be doing?
Yes, great final question. The one thing, the call to action I would ask for you all today is do not sit on the sidelines. You all need to engage with your lobbyists or your association's lobbyists. If you don't have one, get one. You need to advocate your own member of Congress, find out who they are. Our office can help you. And go to their office, visit them in DC, provide them the data that says this is good for jobs, this is good for the economy, this is good to get people off of addiction, that cannabis is an off-ramp, not an on-ramp, that that this is a good thing overall for the country, and to get on board with the States Reform Act or any other bill that you think is right, but one that's actually going to have a chance to pass. We need you to call your member, email your member, write letters, show up to their office with other people from the industry with all this data and information. And so you can write down our website. My website is mace.house.gov. It's Mace like the pepper spray, but only sweeter, unless you're nasty, and then it's all over. But it's mace.house.gov. You can go to /SRA, and you can learn about the States Reform Act, and you can also click a button at the bottom of that page and contact my office. We'll help you figure out who your member of Congress is, and we'll ask for your help because we're going to need it.
Awesome. Nancy, thank you.
Thank you all, and God bless.
Thanks, everybody.